President Nicholas, live stream is now in progress. You may turn on your mic and open the meeting.
Good afternoon and welcome to the May 25th, 2022 special board meeting of the Capistrano Unified School District. The meeting is now in session. The time is 3:33. Per CDPH and Cal OSHA guidelines, the use of masks is strongly recommended but not required when indoors at the district office. Members of the public may attend this meeting in person or participate by phone. A registration link has been posted and on the meeting agenda page of our website for those who plan to call in to address the board this evening. Please note if we have any students registered to speak this evening on any agenda item, we will hear them before any adult speaker. As a reminder, speaker cards will only be accepted for 30 minutes after the start of the open session per board policy 9323 meeting conduct. Mrs. Hayes, please call the roll.
Student Advisor Padia.
Here.
Trustee Bullicus.
Here.
Trustee Castellanos.
Here.
Trustee Davis.
Here.
Trustee Hanachek.
Here.
Trustee Jones.
User.
Trustee Jones is online. Trustee McNicholas.
Here. And I apologize for saying it's Hayes, Ms. Schmidt, right? Can I?
Trustee Jones.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was trying to unmute, but I'm here.
Thank you. Let's see. Let's have John Forney lead the Pledge of Allegiance for us.
We stand, put your right hand over your heart. Ready, begin.
And to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, John. May I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved. Second.
Moved by Trustee Davis, second by Trustee Bullicus.
Student Advisor Padia.
Aye.
Trustee Bullicus.
Aye.
Trustee Castellanos. Aye. Trustee Davis.
Aye.
Trustee Hanachek.
Aye.
Trustee Jones.
Aye.
Trustee McNicholas.
Aye. Motion passes 6-0 with a preferential vote of aye from Student Advisor Padia. We now move to the consent calendar. Please note per board policy 9323 and in accordance with the law, the public has a right to comment on any consent item. At the request of any member of the board, any item on the consent agenda shall be removed and given individual attention for action as a special agenda item. The total time for consent calendar shall be 20 minutes. Individual speakers will be allowed between 1 and 3 minutes to address the board. Ms. Schmidt, do we have any speaker cards for the consent calendar?
We do not.
Okay, do any trustees have any consent items you'd like to pull, realizing there's only one? Trustee Davis? No? Okay. All right, then may I have a motion to approve the consent calendar item 5A1?
Motion to approve. Second.
Moved by Trustee Bullicus, second by Trustee Davis. Ms. Schmidt, please call the roll.
Student Advisor Padia.
Aye.
Trustee Bullicus.
Aye.
Trustee Castellanos. Aye. Trustee Davis.
Aye.
Trustee Hanachek.
Aye.
Trustee Jones.
Aye.
Trustee McNicholas.
Aye. Motion carries 6-0-1 with a preferential vote of aye from Student Advisor Padia. Discussion action item 6A1, presentation on results of Aliso Viejo School Facilities Improvement District Bond Feasibility. This is Mr. Hampton.
Thank you, President McNicholas, trustees. So as part of the research that we're doing for a potential bond measure in Aliso Viejo, there was a poll held to determine the viability, the feasibility of the bond measure. And Tim McClarney with True North Research is here to present the results of that poll. So I give you Tim McClarney, who is online.
Thank you, Clark. And good afternoon, Madam President, members of the board. Tim McClarney with True North Research. I have to apologize in advance for my voice. It may cut out a little bit or cough. I managed to get COVID on a flight late last week, and so I've been struggling with that for the last couple of days. But we should be able to get through this okay. Tonight's PowerPoint presentation covers the highlights of the survey we recently conducted to look at the feasibility of a bond in the Aliso Viejo SFID. That is essentially a school facilities improvement district that would be drawn with a boundary that matches the city of Aliso Viejo. As I go through tonight's presentation, I welcome questions from the board along the way or at the end, whichever is your preference. Next slide, please. So before we jump into the results, helpful to take a quick moment to review the purpose of the study as well as the methodology. In terms of the purpose of the study, it really boils down to these three bullets here. The first is to understand if a bond measure within the city of Aliso Viejo to repair and improve schools in that city is feasible. And what I mean by that is if you as a board were to choose to place it on the November ballot, does it have a reasonable chance of success? In the case that we find that a measure is feasible, the second bullet there kicks in gear, and that is to understand how might we go about structuring a measure in a way that it's consistent with the type of measure that voters in the city of Aliso Viejo are interested in supporting. Lots of components to a bond package, not the least of which is the list of projects and improvements that would be part of your project list, the overall bond amount, the tax rate, the types of accountability provisions that we built in. All of these are decisions that you as a board would have to make along the way toward placing a measure on the ballot, and the survey can help guide those. Then finally, it's an opportunity to understand the importance of information and helping voters come to an opinion about your proposed bond measure. I'm a big believer that if a public agency is going to take the step of placing a bond measure on the ballot and asking voters to make a decision about that measure, it's really incumbent upon that agency to inform voters about the decision they're asking them to make. As a public agency, you're not allowed to advocate up or down using public resources, but you are certainly encouraged to inform voters about the decision you're asking them to make, and the survey can help guide those communications as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the methodology, the fielding date was May 5th to May 12th, so fairly recent. That's important because, as you know, a lot of things have changed in the last few months. We've had confirmation that inflation's running at 40-year highs. We have gas prices nearly doubling. We also have the pandemic that is, although we're somewhat in a better place with it overall, it's still around, as I discovered this week. And so these are storm clouds that are in our atmosphere. And these storm clouds have been here, and they were around and on voters' minds as they were taking the survey. And so the point of that is that any sort of effects of these things like inflation and gas prices and uncertainty where the economy is going, et cetera, these are all baked into these results. We don't have a situation where we've done the polling and then after the polling, these storm clouds moved in. We wound up speaking with 411 voters in the SFID who are what we call likely November 2022 voters. These are voters who we would expect to cast a ballot on the national in the November 2022 election. We use what's called a stratified and clustered random sampling methodology. What that does in essence is allows us to ensure that at the end of this process, our sample of 411 voters matches very closely the profile of that likely November 2022 universe on all the dimensions that are related to voting behavior. So age, gender, partisanship, household party type, they all line up. Once selected at random, we recruited using 3 methods: email, text, and telephone. We allowed folks to participate either online or by telephone. Everything's protected, so only those people who we invited to take the survey could take it. They can only take it one time. They couldn't forward their invite to their 10 best friends and ask them to take it. So we ensure the integrity of the sample that way. And because this was a random sample of 411 and not a census of all of your likely November voters, it has what's known as a margin of error due to sampling. In this case, that's plus or minus 4.8%. What that means is we can be 95% confident that the results we'll talk about today are within 4.8% of what we would have found had we spoken with all of your likely November 2022 voters. Next slide, please. So on to the results. This first slide shows the results of our importance of issues question, and where for each of the issues on the left side of the slide, we simply ask voters to tell us how important is it to them. Is it extremely important, very important, somewhat important, not at all important? We asked these items in a random order, but have sorted them from high to low based on that combined percentage of folks who said it's either extremely or very important, and that combined percentage is shown in the box off to the right of those bars. This question is used as a nice warm-up question, kind of makes good on that promise that this was a survey about local issues. We get right to that. It's also a nice warm-up question, gets respondents thinking about local issues at the beginning of the survey. And thirdly, though, it's an opportunity for us to understand how education as a topic stacks up against these other issues that also compete for tax dollars. And in particular, how does the topic of improving the quality of education in local public schools stack up against the issue of preventing local tax increases? And you can see here that the number one issue overall was improving the quality of education in local public schools. I got 84% of Aliso Viejo voters tell us that was extremely very important, followed by maintaining local streets and roads, improving public safety, and then preventing local tax increases. That gap between 84% for improving the quality of education in the local public schools and 64% for preventing local tax increases is about 20%. That's not bad. For most school districts that we're working with the last two cycles, we're seeing a typical gap of like 22, 23%. So it's a little lower than some, but not a lot. The other thing I will point out, though, is you go all the way to the bottom, repairing and upgrading aging school facilities, that in general checked in at 61%. So it's a very interesting disconnect here between the item at the very top of the list and the item at the very bottom of the list, right? That they rate improving the quality of education in local public schools as a number one issue. But obviously, some voters aren't getting the connection between, your facility conditions and that overarching goal of improving the quality of education. And so this is a reminder that as you move forward with a bond measure, although bonds are about capital improvements, they're about facilities. At the end of the day, what is going to ultimately kind of determine the success of a measure is the ability to connect the dots between what it is you're doing in terms of facilities, but why it is that it matters in a classroom and in your core mission of educating students. Next slide, please. Hold on, let's take a quick sip of Gatorade. Okay, so at this point, we get right down to business with what we call the initial ballot test. And the idea is before we get any deeper into the interview, we start talking about possible tax rates that could be associated with the measure, talk about projects that can be funded, arguments pro and con. We want to present to respondents a mock-up of what we think that 75-word ballot statement could look like and get their reaction. It's a really good gauge of where your voters are at on the natural with respect to this proposal, because we haven't presented them with any information beyond what you see here in the 75 words. And you can see here that this measure is going to do all these things shown in the bullets. And it's going to authorize about $77 million, levying 3 cents per $100 of assessed value, raise about $4 million annually while bonds are outstanding. So that was the 75-word ballot statement. And next slide is the results. At that initial ballot test, we had 60% of respondents say that they would support this proposal. We had 30% opposed. We had about 9% who were unsure. So in the state of California, for a Prop 39 bond to be successful, we need 55% support. So right at that initial ballot test, we're about 5 points over that 55% threshold. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting things is, although we wrote the ballot language specific to Aliso Viejo schools, the fact that all the money would stay local to Aliso Viejo may not be obvious to a respondent. So we followed up that initial ballot test with the statement, by law, all the money from the measure I just described will stay in Aliso Viejo and be dedicated to repairing and improving local classrooms and school facilities. It can't be taken away by the state or diverted to schools outside Aliso Viejo. And knowing this, would you vote yes or no on the measure? You can see here that simply informing them that all the money will raise in Aliso Viejo will stay in Aliso Viejo, this is all about their community, has a strong positive impact on support for the proposal, and it jumps to 68% very quickly. Next slide. Now, naturally, support for any type of tax measure can depend on the price tag. The more expensive a measure is, all other things being equal, the less the level of aggregate support we could expect. And one of the goals of this survey was to make it clear that bonds mean taxes, just in case they haven't picked that up in the 75 words, but also to understand how sensitive are voters to the tax rate that could be associated with this proposal, and also their understanding of or how they would react to the tax implications being expressed in a couple different ways. And so the first question in this series presented voters with each of the tax rates you see there on the left side of the slide from high to low. And ask them at each one of these rates, $30 per 100,000 of assessed value, 24 and 20, whether they would support or oppose the proposal. And you can see that the nature of the question is you put the blinders on a respondent and you focus their attention on the cost of the measure. Support tends to go down at at $30 per 100,000 assessed. Support checked in at 54%, $24 at 55%. When we get down to 20, it jumps up to 57%. This is known to be a pretty conservative read on voter support for a proposal, because not only are we putting the blinders on them and focusing their attention on the cost, it's also the case that not everybody knows how to translate the statement $30 per 100,000 assessed valuation into a meaningful price tag. You have to know what AV is. You have to know what the AV is on your property. You have to be able to do math on the fly in the space of an interview fairly quickly. Not everybody is good at those things, understandably. And so when they know you're talking about the price tag, but they don't really know what it adds up to, some voters will tend to hedge. They'll tend to say no or not sure. So on the next slide, we approach it a little differently. And we say, let me put it another way. This is the left column. If you knew that this measure would cost the typical homeowner in the district $144 per year, would you vote yes or no? The $144 per year is the $30 per 100,000 assessed valuation tax rate multiplied times the median AV for residential property in the SFID. That's how you get to $144 per year. And when expressed as an annual total, you'll see that we get a somewhat better reaction. We wind up at 59% support at the $144. Same exercise on the right, the $96 per year. That's based off that $20 tax rate. And at that number, we're sitting up a little over 60%. So when you go and do the math for them and it comes out to be a modest number, as we see here, we are getting a boost in support when they have take the mystery out of what the price tag is going to be. Next slide, please. Excuse me.
Mr. McLaren, could I interrupt for 1 second? Are the respondents told, is it made clear to them that the $100 not the last question, but the question before, that the $100 per assessed per the dollars per 100,000 of assessed value is not the same as market value, or they just say assessed value and they don't mention not the same?
Yeah, we do say it's assessed value, not market value, but not everybody still knows what that means.
Right. I'm just wondering, because I find that when one goes out to talk about it, they don't know. And I thought that if you didn't prompt for that, you might get a lower positive than if you just said $100, some number of dollars per 100K. But if you are clarifying a little bit, then okay, that's all I wanted to know. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for those in the know, they get it. For those that may be a little confused, but clarification works. But then there's that group of folks who don't know what assessed valuation is and or wouldn't be able to guess at what their property's assessed value is. And that's for those folks, it's kind of a confusing question. The problem is that's how it's expressed 75 words. And in the tax rate statement, that is part of the resolution. And so it's important to kind of mimic that in the poll, because whatever confusion we're seeing in our poll would be echoed on election day, right? Okay, so after the tax rate discussion, we move on to the projects and improvements section of the survey. And this is where we're trying to do two things. On the one hand, we're now starting to educate this respondent more about what your bond will accomplish. Up till this point, they only had the 75-word ballot statement. We're pretty constrained about how we could describe what your proposal would do. Here we get to unpack it into all the projects you see here on this page. And in that way, they're getting a better idea about what the bond measure would accomplish. It's also an opportunity for us to understand, of all the ways you can spend the money, how they feel about each of those ways, and also which of the projects and improvements ultimately rise to the top of the list in terms of voters' priorities. A couple things that stand out right away from this slide. There's nothing on this list of projects and improvements that's unpopular. Even the lowest rated item there had 75% of respondents say that they would support this proposal. I mean, they would support using some of the money on that item. And when you get to the top of the list, though, it's an interesting mix of STEM related improvements, career tech, and then basic repairs to your facilities, roofs, plumbing, electrical, et cetera, bringing your old schools up to new school standards, AC, improvements, and instructional technology. So that top tier, which I would kind of draw the top, say, 6 bars there, which sort of stand out from the rest. That's the list of projects there. That's kind of a common combination, maybe with the exception of the AC, that we're seeing in a lot of districts. Voters prize them. They're very interested in career tech, and they want to make sure you're keeping your older school. They'd like to see the older facilities move up to new school standards.
I have a question.
Yep.
So when you surveyed, so these questions here, did you do them in this order? Like if you were talking to me, I would have the first one be upgrade classrooms, and then my last one would have been upgrade classrooms facilities. Were they done in this order for the people being surveyed?
They were randomized for every respondent.
So it wasn't like, because you know what it looks like is you just ran out of steam. You start, oh,
Yeah.
and then by your last question, like, hey, whatever, I still support it, but so okay, so they're randomized. So I just wanted to know. Thank you.
They are. Next slide, please. So, if the board chooses to place this measure on the ballot, there's going to be an election cycle. And during that election cycle, there will be a lot of discussion and debate in the community about this proposal. You will undoubtedly have members of the community that will stand up and advocate on behalf of this measure. They'll reach out to their friends and neighbors and explain why this is needed and why they should vote yes. You might also have some opponents who stand up and try and argue that this is not needed and we shouldn't be doing this. For this to be a reliable gauge of the feasibility of a bond measure, we need to simulate that discussion and debate in the space of this interview, so we have a realistic understanding not only of where your voters on the natural, which was that initial ballot test, but what happens to their support for this proposal once they've been exposed to arguments both pro and con about the bond. And so you can see here is a list of the positive arguments we tested in the poll, and quite a few of them get some traction with voters. The first one is a STEM related argument that if we want our kids to succeed in college and careers, they must be skilled in the use of today's technology and have a solid background in science, math, engineering, and technology. And this measure is going to make that possible. And then the next two are accountability provisions. Number 2 being just the Prop 39 accountability protections that are built into any Prop 39 bond, Citizens Oversight Committee, independent audits, public disclosure of how all monies are spent, as well as that all the money is going to be staying local to Aliso Viejo. So now at this point in the poll, voters have heard more about this proposal than they did initially. We had a chance to talk about the tax rates. And as you saw, that tends to be a bit of a wet blanket on support for the bond. But then we had a chance also to talk a bit about the types of projects that would be funded, as well as convey these positive arguments. And so we circle back in the next slide to what we call the interim ballot test, and where we present that same 75-word statement and ask them, now that they've heard more, where do they stand? And you can see here at the interim ballot statement, we are up to 65% support for this proposal. That's about 10 points above that 55% threshold you need to be successful. Next slide, please. And then we get to the negatives. And the idea behind the negatives is I'm going to put my opponent hat on, and I'm going to pepper respondents with a series of negative arguments, the kind of negative arguments I'd expect you may encounter during an upcoming election cycle, to get an understanding of how resilient voter support is for this proposal should you get opposition. And you can see here that we didn't pull any punches. We kind of came at this from all directions. The number one negative there at the top was just that, you just received a bunch of money in pandemic relief funds. The state has $30 billion in surplus, and that means schools are going to be getting more money in the future. We don't need to raise taxes. Second argument is just that this is a horrible time to be thinking about raising taxes. We've got a pandemic, inflation, high gas prices, right? So all the kind of arguments you would think, yeah, I may expect to hear that during the election cycle, because again, we wanted to see ultimately how much erosion we could create in the space of this interview based on these negatives. And the answer to that is on the next slide. You can see that the negatives do cool us down, but we are landing at the end at 59% support. So we're still about 4 points above that 55% threshold that you need to be successful on election day. Next slide. As part of the poll, we also had a couple follow-up questions where we asked voters to tell us in this slide here whether they have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the Capistrano Unified School District. You can see here that about 75% of the voters in the city of Aliso Viejo have a favorable opinion of the district. Next slide. We also, for those folks who had favorable or unfavorable opinions, to see if they want to tell us why in their own words, This was an open-ended question, which we then went back and reviewed the verbatim responses and grouped them into categories you see here. Now, one thing to note, these green and red bars, the green are the percentage up to 100 of those who had a favorable opinion of the district. So it shows how the favorable opinions distributed on those open-ended questions. The red bars are the distribution based on the unfavorable opinions. And so, but keep in mind, the unfavorable opinions ultimately represent a much smaller percentage of all voters than the favorable opinions. But you can see here that on the positive side, among the specific responses, the green bars, they mentioned some experience that their family or friend or their personal experience being a positive experience there, a reference to the high quality of teachers and staff, positive comments in general. Among the negative, the folks had unfavorable opinion. The number one item there had to do with essentially the content of teaching. This is where you see references to CRT or political content and the concerns about teaching, or indoctrinating kids in one way or another. And then also some comments of quality of staff and administration. Next slide, please. All right, so what does all this mean? I'm going to circle back to that first overarching question I mentioned at the outset. That is a main motivator for doing this work, which is that simple question of, is it feasible? If the board were to choose to place an Aliso Viejo SFID bond on the November ballot, does it have a reasonable chance of success? I'm going to give that a qualified yes. What I mean by qualified yes is yes, with careful planning and execution. Why the yes? Well, there's a lot of the things that we want to see in place for a measure to be feasible. We see here in this poll under positive signs. We saw that the voters in this SFID ranked improving the quality of education in local schools as being the most important issue facing the community, significantly higher than the issue of preventing local tax increases. We saw, just based on that 75 per ballot statement at the initial ballot test, we had 60% support among Aliso Viejo voters, and that quickly jumped to 68% with clarification that all the monies would stay local to improve Aliso Viejo schools. The projects that we tested were popular. All the positive arguments resonated, and importantly, at each point that we circled back to a respondent, we said, now that you've heard a bit more, where do you stand? All of those ballot tests were above 55%, and that was even after opposition arguments. And so that's the kind of pattern we want to see for a measure to have a reasonable chance of success on election day. There's also some challenges, though, that pop out from the survey that are important to keep in mind. The first is that, recall that boost from it being an SFID and all the money staying local, that didn't come out naturally with the 75-word ballot statement. It came out right after, when we had room to clarify how this works. It's going to be difficult to there are some tweaks I think we can make to the 75-word ballot statement to hopefully get that point across a little better. But ultimately, this is a communication challenge that we're going to have to overcome. Meaning, it's going to be important that voters understand that they're not necessarily getting it on the natural. So we have to make sure that that message gets out there to voters separate from that 75-word ballot statement. We also saw some tax rate sensitivity. One of the questions I fielded early on about this was, well, why are we only doing $30? Why didn't we go to 60 or 50 or 40? Past polling in your community has shown that a lot of these communities are tax rate sensitive. There's just not the support to go out at $60 or $50, not even close. And one of the concerns about starting high with a number like that is that you have the effect of sticker shocking somebody, that the moment they think that you may be going out with a $60 per 100,000 assessed valuation tax rate, or even a 50, they kind of shut down. And they just keep that in mind. They've already made their decision. They're not going for this. And as you go through the poll, you don't learn as much. So we set that tax rate at a number that we felt is within the reasonable level that we think that you can hit your 55% with this group. And even with that, as you saw, when the conversation circles around the tax rate, we saw some sensitivity there. We do also see that negative arguments get traction. And so, if you're looking ahead towards election day and thinking that you could see organized opposition, you need to sort of factor that into your decisions, because the negative arguments do have some pull. And then finally, there's all these unknowns, and they're not unknowns because we don't know about them now, but it's unknown kind of how they're going to unfold moving forward. So the pandemic is still with us. And as you know, that can create a lot of drama at the school level, especially if we get back into mask mandates and other things from the state. We have inflation that everyone's aware of and hopefully is going downhill, but we'll see where that lands come November. And then we also have international conflict. We're not sure to what extent we're going to get sucked into what's going on in Ukraine even deeper. All of these things are sort of macro level effects that we can't do anything about, but we need to kind of keep in mind because they can create some headwinds heading towards election day. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide. A couple observations and recommendations. The first is just to remind us all that a poll like this is a snapshot in time. It's not a crystal ball, right? It's not looking forward to election day and saying you're going to get 60% on election day. It's telling us where your voters at today and also how they're likely to react to the types of information they can encounter during election cycle. But ultimately, what happens on election day is dictated by everything that happens from this point forward. And so it's a reminder that we got to make smart decisions about how you structure this measure so that it's viewed as affordable and also is consistent with the priorities that your voters have expressed. And it's also important to put the work in, right? This poll is really kind of the beginning of the conversation with the community, not the end of the conversation. And so if you decide to move forward, there should be some district level communications out there to help sort of connect the dots for voters about what your facility conditions are within Aliso Viejo and what you'd like to do in terms of these funds and help start building consensus around a proposal. And there will need to be an independent campaign that can go out and be a voice for this measure during the election cycle when, as a public agency, the district would need to be quiet. And so with that, let me end my presentation. I welcome questions from the board if there are any.
Ms. Schmidt, do we have any speaker cards for this item?
We do. We have one speaker in person and one online.
Hey, could you please call the speakers?
Veronica Yap.
Good afternoon, President McNicholas, Superintendent Mattel-Brulti, and trustees. My name is Veronica Yap. I have a 5th grader at DJ's who was going to be here, but she's at science camp today, so yay. And an 8th grader at DJAMS. I'm here to ask you to please move forward with the AV bond. You have a group of committed Aliso Viejo community members and parents that are willing to do the work, even if our kids won't see the results. I know my 8th grader won't, possibly my 5th grader, but we love our community and we believe in public schools. A lot of us worked on Measure I, and we are aware of the work and the commitment that is needed. I want to thank you for your time and ask you to please move forward with the bond.
And Michelle Apostle Campbell.
Good evening or good afternoon. Welcome to the last few days of school. Thank you for listening to this information on the polling. I wish all of our polling numbers had always come back this high. For CUSD, these are amazingly high numbers, and I would support moving forward with a bond in the Aliso Viejo area based upon these numbers and knowing the community as a whole. So once again, thank you for considering this bond and potentially moving forward with it.
Okay, trustees, comments and questions? Trustee Davis?
Is this the same tax rate that we proposed in the last two bonds for CUSD?
Sorry. I think in some of the early polling, we have explored a little higher and found no support for that. So the more recent polls, we started at $30, for example, I think was the max that we tested with respect to the Dana Hills High School SFID. And I believe, I don't have it in front of me, again, because I'm kind of quarantined in my back bedroom, but I believe that's what we had in the follow-up SFID polls back in 2020.
Yeah, Measure I was $30 per $100,000.
Okay.
Or 3 cents per $100.
The results seem very similar to the previous bond feasibility surveys. Can you speak on that?
They're actually higher. Right away, we get a little bit of a boost from the fact that it references just Aliso Viejo in the ballot language. Once we're able to kind of clarify that all the money stays local to Aliso Viejo, the number shoots up. As you saw, we jump up to 68%. And although that fades a little bit over the space of the poll, even after negatives, we land at 59%. We've not had a poll in your district where after negatives, we've been at 59%. It's always been right on the bubble, a point or two, maybe higher than 55 or even a point or two lower.
Trustee Bullock, did you have a question?
I have a couple questions. But when we put out Measure I, did we not state it would stay in the community, much like this one?
Measure I was Aliso, Viejo, and Laguna Niguel, and Dana Point.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. So I just have one question, it's kind of twofold. Hopefully, Mr. Hampton can answer. Because we will, just as Tim had mentioned, we'll need to do on staff efforts in educating. We have the committee, you know, the community that will do educating, but we'll have to put together information about what kinds of things we're looking at, what kinds of projects we're looking to do in the elementary versus middle or high school. So can you tell us in some roundabout numbers from our past, what would it take in fundraising for an outside group to raise monies to get the lift off of this ballot measure in the community? And what does it cost us in the district in terms of staff working on this in general?
We have to be careful not to talk about the campaign, because the campaign has to be separate from the district. So I think you can just talk about once.
I was prefacing educating is what we do.
So I was
And
gonna delineate
what they
those
do
things.
is campaigning, correct?
Yeah, so I just fundraising for a campaign, all of those questions Clark's unable to answer, but he can talk about educating and then what happens once it's on the ballot in terms of education.
Okay,
So-
well, maybe Clark can answer it. Does anybody know Measure I, perhaps Trustee Castellanos knows out in the community what it took? I just wonder if anybody knows, in round numbers.
Well, so I think this is what's hard, right? Our bond counsel is here, so I'm just very careful. In general, the board, once you put something on the ballot, you can't have campaign. In general, H&I raised $300,000. But again, I just want to be cautious about having that conversation in the boardroom.
Maybe I can have a clarifying on that, but what has it cost us in the past to put the bonds on the ballot?
So it doesn't cost the district any money, right? In the campaigns, we don't do that work. The campaign completely does that work. They fundraise the money, they do the door hangers, they do whatever it is. And as a district, we're required by law to have nothing to do with that. Once the board puts it on the ballot, which potentially could be June 15th, we actually step away and a campaign takes over. I'm only reporting, given on my free time work that I did, that I am aware that that was money that was fundraised by the campaign, not by the district.
There are things, though, that we can and do spend resources on as far as education, explaining to the communities what this is and what it would do.
We're obligated to do that, actually, to inform the community what the bond measure, not only what it costs the taxpayer, but what the work that will happen with it. And so with all the bond measures, we've done that kind of communication, that information, provide that information to the community.
And have we ever calculated what that cost was?
It varies by the size of the bond measure. So I mean, in my experience, not saying, because I don't know off the top of my head what we spent in communication on potential bonds, but it can range from being inexpensive, like $20,000 to $30,000 up to $150,000 for a school district to do the communication based on how far and wide the communication needs to go.
So Janet, can you please just come up and clarify? I think this is a really important point because this runway is shorter than our runways in the past. If these were to go on the ballot for 2022 after June 15th, what education would this district be able to do?
Right. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So you can continue to do your educational activities after the bond is called. It's just that once the measure is on the ballot, the sort of the scrutiny and I think the strictness about what those materials say becomes a little bit higher, because the closer you get to the election, the more something that is informational before you call the election starts to look like or can look like advocacy. So unfortunately, or, it's not always a bright line test, as you know, because language sometimes can be received differently than it's intended. So we do have a shorter runway if you call the election sooner, because at that point, it's clear there's something to advocate for. Right now, there isn't the measure on the ballot. And so there's a sort of general sense that the prohibition and the distinction between the two hasn't totally kicked in unless and until you call the measure. So when you call it early, it just means that you have to be very, very careful and very, very deliberate at making sure you know what that line is and that the activities you're engaging in that are paid for by the district and or organized by district staff, et cetera, are very factual, fair, and impartial and informational, as opposed to something designed to persuade the reader or the recipient of the information to vote for it. Did that answer the question clearly enough?
I think it answers the what, it doesn't answer the how much.
Right.
Clark, could we get that information on what we
I
have
can look
spent
up
on
the
potential
details
bonds in
on
the
it.
past?
Yes, for H&I can look up what the detailed costs were for that.
Trustee Hanachek, did you have a comment? Question?
Yeah, I mean, I might as well tag on to the conversation here. What I found in the last two bond cycles is when we do our education, it's really the education that our community needs to hear. So most of our folks have no idea how schools are funded. We have no idea what our surrounding school districts, why they look like that and we don't. And so it's really a kind of just a nuts and bolts workaday information that is always important. So we should be doing it all the time, whether we're in a bond cycle or not, because folks just do not connect the dots or understand why their schools look this way and they live with these houses that look like this. They just don't get it. So that is really good work we do, and it's probably ongoing that we always have to do at all times. A couple of things that's definitely, I think we need to delineate the difference between this time around for Aliso and what we've done in the past. And I don't think we articulated. So the SFID that we okayed is city delineated. Is that correct? The city boundary delineated. So it's not, we didn't do, unlike before, kind of school boundaries. So this is really a city boundary delineated bond, right?
It's the boundaries of the city of Aliso Viejo within the Capistrano Unified School District.
Within the Capistrano Unit, yeah, okay. So I think that's really, really important because there's city pride, there's, this is a unique community too within our school district that oftentimes doesn't share a lot of boundaries like that. So I think that's just something that I don't see quite in the polling presentation exactly like that, but just wanted to confirm that.
Trustee Bolkus?
So on that note, and just interestingly, how many schools is this? Because this isn't then all of area, what's your number, 5? It's all of area 5. Okay, so, and is there any schools that are in Aliso Viejo that would be in area, whatever's the border 6, or your area, area 4?
Attendance boundary wise, I don't think there's any.
I'm talking about any schools that would be a part of this bond, that would get work done. They're all in Aliso Viejo in CUSD. Are they all in area 5? That clarifies my
I
question.
believe so.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
1 high school, 4 elementaries, 2 middles. Unless I'm wrong, Mr. Hampton.
I'm looking at it right now, but I don't want to answer without knowing for sure. But
There are, as you know, though, attendance boundary wise, there are students that live in Laguna Niguel that attend schools in Aliso Viejo.
That area is not included in this bond because in previous bonds, they did not
Well, I would defer that question to trustee Castellanos and her task force, because I think that was discussed.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it was basically that the numbers coming out of Aliso in our areas were typically stronger in polling versus the other areas of the district, like Miguel, Dana, when we did measure I.
The families that attend, that are in Laguna Niguel but attend schools in Aliso Viejo
Will
would
not-
not be part of this
Not-
bond.
Correct.
So
they will get the advantages, but they won't get taxed.
Modernized schools.
Because they were not a higher percentage,
the question
Support
is
for the
area,
right? Isn't that what we determined?
Well, I guess that was the reason why the city boundary was chosen.
Yes.
so trustee area, what was the trustee areas? 4,
5 and 6.
5 and 6. So all, I think the SFID 3, which is this Aliso Viejo, is all within trustee area. Trustee area 4, or the one for Aliso Viejo for Kristen's area.
Yes.
It's all, it's entirely. in it.
Yes, it's all in the city. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I think. So. Yes, it is. Yes, I'm 5.
Pardon me, may I make a comment?
Yes, sorry, Gila, go ahead.
No, it's quite all right. I wanted to comment that when we did Measure M, former trustee Reardon very much wanted us to, instead of doing what we did, basically district-wide, go by city. And part of the reason is that cities have a certain, a vibe, and cities have city leadership. And you can't really say, well, this goes into this school and the part goes into this school, partly because it just doesn't work out, and partly because that kind of isn't how cities work. A lot of school districts have only 1 or 2 cities that they cover. We're unique in that we have many cities, and the messaging kind of needs to be a little bit different. In addition, with a school of choice, which is very much used throughout our district, you could get somebody who lives in Ladera Ranch who goes to an Aliso Viejo school. You can get someone in San Clemente or Mission Viejo who goes to an Aliso Viejo school. So we're never going to be able to find just the voters whose kids go to this school. We sort of need to just do as Trustee Reardon suggested many years ago, well, not so many years ago, but a number of years ago, and stay with city boundaries, which is a natural sort of political and community boundary, rather than trying to get into attendance areas and a lot of other things that are much harder to track.
Thank you, trustee Bolkes.
I was just gonna say, I agree with trustee Jones. We're not trying to get into that. We just want to delineate.
Right, to understand, yeah. Trustee Hanachek, did you have a question or comment? Okay. Trustee Castellanos, you?
No, I just think that when we worked on the previous measure and we were out, campaigning and asking voters kind of what they thought or what their opinions were, it was unique to me to hear. I walked in many different cities, but specifically to Aliso Viejo, it was, well, no, I don't really, nobody likes tax, right? Nobody's in favor of being taxed. But are we talking about our schools? And I said, yes, this is about your schools. Oh, then I'm in favor of supporting the schools. So that was the difference. Our values are definitely here. We put forth an effort with our schools. We support our schools. We want modernized schools. We know the only way we can get that is through a measure, through a bond. And I think our city is there. And I think it shows in the polling.
Trustee Hanachek?
Just kind of more of a philosophical thing. Early on with this school district, obviously this district drove the growth of Orange County, and then it responded to the growth of Orange County. And I believe, and we thought more in a collective thing. When my children were little, I thought of Capistrano Unified School District. This is how I thought. I didn't think of cities. I didn't think of anything like this. I thought of schools as the entity under this umbrella. So somewhere along the line, we've kind of gotten away from that. It could be even our local politics, you know, exerting their influence, right? It could be a myriad of things. So I think I think this is good to think, in this case, we'll try it with the Aliso Viejo. It is a unique thing, city that also has the schools that are right in there. I do think that if I was looking at it now and kind of this way people seem to view it now, if you think of, there's a direct correlation between improved schools and your property values. So a community like Aliso Viejo, a little more competitive with surrounding communities, this could be a really great thing. Because they think, you guys probably think in terms, not Capo Unified, but Aliso, you are Aliso citizens. You're a newer community, right? So you weren't even a blink in my eye when my kids were little. So I think this is unique. I think it's a unique opportunity. We have now entered the phase. We do not have the luxury that how other school districts go, that collective lift doesn't seem to be received throughout the school district, even though that is the optimum way to go, where everyone is lifted. And that way, it doesn't matter where your kids flow to, you're all Capo Unified and we all benefit from it. That's not going to happen. So I support this. Do we need a vote on this?
This is information only. Our vote is on the next item. The one thing I'd like to add is, actually, I think, Trustee Hanachek, you said it before, that we need to do a lot of education, whether we have a bond in your city or not. We still need to do a lot of community education on how schools are funded, whether this is coming up on the June budget or what the governor wants to put for schools, facilities, or programs or whatever. We still have that, I mean, that's, again, with or without a bond, we need to educate our community on how we are spending the money we get and what we can and can't do with it. One of the negative things on the polling, Tim, was, oh, they've just got millions of dollars in COVID money. Why didn't they fix the air conditioning then? And, you know, so we have to say, no, here's what we did, and this is what kept your kids in school. And this is what we did to have enough educators there. And that, I don't think people understand that. So I think there's some education across the board that would help a bond in any area, but I think we need to do it across the board for everything.
And Martha, I just want to add, just looking at our audience members, I just have to thank all the folks in the past for Measure M and H&I. I mean, a huge amount of individuals worked really, really hard to educate their community, reach out to their community, and I am so grateful. They spent their time, they created their own PowerPoints. And this was just in the education cycle. So we're indebted to them. So hopefully that each cycle that we do this, because we don't have any other opportunity, that we build the information and the collective energy, because our schools do need to be more competitive and look like Tustin and Orange and the other San Diego that I just got back from.
Okay, thank you. So this is information only. We'll go on to item 6A2. This is first reading of a potential ballot measure for school facilities improvement, District Number 3, Aliso Viejo School Bond Measure. Mr. Hampton.
Thank you, President McNicholas. So this is also information item only, first reading. This is similar to what the board saw for the Dana Hills High School bond measure. This is the preliminary language for the Aliso Viejo measure, and it includes the bond resolution that would be calling for the measure to be placed on the ballot, the project list, the ballot text, the full ballot text, the 75-word statement, and the tax rate statement. And bond counsel Janet Mueller is here to answer any questions you may have, as well as our financial advisor Keith Weaver.
Ms. Schmidt, do we have any speakers on this item?
We do not.
Okay, trustees, comments, questions? Also note that or maybe I'll ask the question. These are both information items, but on the ballot statement, we will have to vote on that on, what's our timeline on this?
June 15th.
June 15th? Okay. Trustees, any other comments, questions?
I have one comment.
Yeah, yes, TJ.
Just as a follow-up to my last remarks about school choice and Mr. Reardon's view. Mr. Reardon did not vote in favor of Measure M, and he campaigned against it. However, when we broke this out by city with Measure H and I, he not only voted in favor of putting both on the ballot, but he also campaigned for them. Not going door to door, but he spoke to chambers of commerce and city council members and, you know, groups like that, and was very much a supporter of these as long as we were going in city areas. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think, I know there has been discussion on the amount, the bond amount, and I think as Tim said, that they didn't really pull anything higher than 30. I know that was a community question, or, you know, how high can you go? Do we need to, if that would change, we'd have to have that back in the next version by the 15th. If we had information that says, yes, and I don't expect True North to do more polling above 30, but that's our kind of our last chance to do that. Right? Okay. Any other comments, questions? Trustee Bolkus?
What is the deadline to have this on the ballot for November?
I think it's August.
Was it, so Janet can speak to that.
I think there's a number of steps you have to kind of.
What's the on-ramp, as we say?
So the county needs the order of election by August 12th. So we are earlier in the cycle than we need to be for a variety of reasons, but that's technically the deadline. And then just to reorient everybody, because we are doing this SFID, we still have a couple of steps, which will also happen on the 15th. So in other words, we've already called a public hearing. That's what you did at your last meeting for both of the SFIDs. The public hearing will be held on the 15th, followed thereafter by an action by this board to actually order the formation of those districts, thereafter calling an election in one or both. So you'll have a series of actions that will happen leading up to what's planned or proposed actual action on calling a measure. So on the 15th.
Is there something else we have to do between then and August 12th?
No, we just have to deliver the election paperwork to the county. We will need to work behind the scenes to make sure that the county has enough information to create the voter database. Because if we're doing, I guess we've got some information because it'll align with some of the city boundaries, but usually when we create these new voting entities, we have to give them technical information to do that. But as far as your actions as a board, no, you will have taken the final action to put this together by voting on June 15th.
Yeah, so I just want to, just trying to be very proactive. So if the board were not ready to take action on June 15th, then what would that look like? Because their next meeting is July 13th. And then their meeting after that is August 17th, past the deadline. So proactively, they would have to have something on the agenda to build in meetings between June 15th and August 12th, right? So they have a calendar of special and or regular meetings approved if they didn't want to take action on June 15th.
That's right. So the only note I would say is that we've called hearings for the 15th. So I would suggest we continue on that path. We continue on this process of hearing back from the community on the issue. But you don't actually have to take action as to whether we're actually going to call elections within these areas until, well, you have to do it at least by the 11th of August because the 12th it has to be delivered. So it would be, if it's not your July meeting, regular meeting, would have to be another special that you pull together between then and.
So if I agendize, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that.
Hypothetically, we've already called the public hearing. Based on what we hear at the public hearing and our discussion, if we decide to change something to meet the July or whatever, do we have to call another public hearing?
The only event that would trigger that is if you want to change the area. So I think that's the only reason you'd have to re-agendize a public hearing. I can check that for you, but I think it's really only if you've made a material change to what you told the public at your last meeting you were doing as far as the formation of the entity and where it would be.
Again, hypothetically, we say 30 on the bond language, we say $30. 200 people show up and say, we want $31. And we say, okay, we hear you.
Mhm.
We want to change it to 31. Or pick a number. Would we have to call another public hearing for $31?
No. No, because we haven't actually put out any tax rates yet. All we've done is express an intention to form an entity, and we haven't provided any specifics whatsoever about the tax rate.
Don't we have to prove that on?
On the 15th, what's currently scheduled is what you have in front of you. We would have to, and that includes the bond authorization amount, the tax rate, all of that. Now, if we'd put 30 in and we were here that night and you all collectively decided you wanted to call the election, but you wanted to change the tax rate, if we could do that here at the podium, we could do it that way.
Okay,
If we were not comfortable with that for whatever reason, we could put it off till a later meeting. Yeah.
okay, all right, thank you, sorry about
If they want, yeah, I just want to, so in order to support and protect the district, we should put on the agenda the possibility of adding more meetings.
I think that would be wise.
Okay.
I guess I do want to say, because I'm sort of looking at Keith, we need to make sure if we want to change that tax rate, I want to make absolutely sure that we have the ability on the spot to recalculate any information that would go along with that change. And so we might want to foreshadow that a little bit just so that we're prepared for that possibility. Right now, in the draft that you have, we went with a $30, $78 million authorization. And I think that may be the recommendation coming from staff and the team here. But obviously,
From trustees today, do you want us to run the numbers on 31, 32, 33? I think that's so that we're ready to replace all the language
right
on June 15th.
Yes, that would be helpful.
Although it's not, maybe I can't ask this because it's not on this agenda, but the same rules and deadline would apply for the proposed Dana Hills bond as well,
Yes.
as far as dates and changes.
Right. So we have right now, they've been a little off cycle, but on June 15th, we'll be putting them both in lockstep to finish this process.
So for that, what we could do, because it's not agendized for today, the board could email Clark and I saying, I want you to consider this, this, and this, just so that we're ready if in fact there's a change in anything, along with, we'll put on the consent potential board meetings that then you don't have to take action on if you choose not to, but then it protects.
Right, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Trustee Bogus.
Well, I would like to ask trustee Castellanos what her instinct is. Are you thinking that you would like to consider, based on your community, based on what True North has presented, and what the percentages change as the dollar value, goes up? Because I personally wouldn't weigh in on that. I would leave that to get rid of myself.
That's a tough question. And I think the task force, we've had discussions about it. The polling is strong at 30. So I feel like we can get a pass.
In other words, you don't have to give a commitment, but would you like to entertain that thought then?
I think we're going to talk about it. Yeah, I think there'll be some discussion about it, about another number, but I want to confer with them and kind of figure out what we do moving forward. 77 million isn't going to fix all the needs that we have, so we have to prioritize and figure out kind of next steps.
Krista, I think for your task force, you might want to look at other school district models, right? And we have those charts, and I'll look them up, the ones that do that this amount, then this amount, then this, ultimately at a day it adds up to maybe a big kahuna. So you guys could look at it, whatever your, what your values are.
How much is a kahuna? How much is that?
It's 60, what's the maximum?
60.
60, so
Okay, 60.
you look,
Yes.
they end up getting there. but they don't do it all at once. So they do it incrementally, and then some of them, do a different type of bond. They do it's when you do all the technology, thank you. So they'll throw in the technology once they've gotten the infrastructure done.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so
Got it.
there's different ways, obviously, in models, and we don't even have to think about it because it's already done throughout the state. So you've got examples everywhere of how these school districts have modernized their facilities.
Trustee Jones having a hard time hearing us.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So my last question is for the bond measures that we will be taking action on June 15th. To put a bond measure forward, is it a majority vote or does it have to be a percentage of vote?
4 out of 6, is that right, Janet? 4 out of 6.
2/3.
Normally.
4 out of 6 of you now.
Thank you.
Okay, Trustee Davis?
The potential ones that we had on before, the measure H, I, and M, what years were those presented?
2016 was at Measure M, and 2020 was Measure H and I. 3 days before the lockdown. Measure A was 1999.
99.
So that's our, on that chart of how the bond, which districts passed what bonds, we're down there at $9. Okay. Any other questions, comments? I think that is the end of our agenda. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
I'll give it a motion by Trustee Davis, second by Trustee Hanachek. Do we have to do roll call since Gil is outlined? Roll call, please. We do.
Student Advisor Palladio?
Aye.
Trustee Bolocus?
Aye.
Trustee Castellanos?
Aye.
Trustee Davis?
Aye.
Trustee Hanachek? Trustee Jones?
Aye.
Trustee McNicholas?
Aye. Motion passes 6-0 with a preferential vote of aye by Student Advisor Padia. We are adjourned at 4:40 p.m. Thank you.